So I would now like to introduce our panel, which I'm very pleased to introduce. We had, as I said, we had 40-some elders. It's not clear to me, and I don't know if Roy will have a comment on this, is the 50s what our leadership model was. I wasn't quite clear on that, but I know when John Martin came in 1961, he was very instrumental in setting up the council and the elders, which for the most part is carried through with some alterations. The council's now a strategic planning team, but and Ammon Kaufman, from what I could see, was our first elder. But today we have Roy Burkholder, who served from 1974 to 78, and then 1980 to 1986. Don Kemmer, who served 3 non-consecutive terms, 1979 to 83, 1987 to 1990, 1993 to 1996, and Don Horning, 1983 to 1986, and then rather than continue as elder, he served as chair of the Building for Our Future Committee, which was a very key point for the congregation in the 80s. So we will start with Roy, and he will present, and then we will go to Don Horning, and then Don Kemmer, and then open it up for questions.
Okay, am I coming through? Yeah, okay, yeah. Very good. It's good to be here. I think it's a little humorous, though, that this is a meeting on elders with a capital E. And up here, we have elders with a small e. I think that's kind of interesting. That, and you may laugh about it if you want to. But well, when I say elders, Don Horning is 80. Don Kemmer is 89, and I am 90. So we are elders with a small e. Okay. I thought I might give a little bit of background. I'm not sure if Rick has this planned anywhere else or not. We try to work things out. To the okay, hold it. I'm sorry, Rick. Please remind me of that if I forget. Elders began by John Martin. How many remember John Martin? Well, a lot of you do, yeah. In 1963. And as Rick has said, the first elders were Ammon Kaufman, Luke Brubaker, Ford Berg, and Roy Nisley. Ford Berg died the following year, and so, of course, none of these are living anymore. 1963 they started. So John Martin began the elder program, and he saw it as elders as spiritual advisors to the pastor, dealing with controversial issues and other issues. I think that was the purpose of it. It would take the role of a deacon. They didn't, Nashville never had deacons, but in Lancaster Conference there were deacons who did the who did the dirty work in the church. And so the elders would do that sort of thing, visiting members who are not in order or things like that. So I think that was the background of it. Of those first 4 elders, Ammon served 17 years, and Luke served 21 years. So Luke and Ammon were the stalwart ones, and in the elders, the rest kind of filled in as it went along. None of us were elders when under John Martin. Clyde Fulmer was the pastor when I became an elder. Was that true with you, Don, too?
Yes.
Yeah. Don and I overlapped as elders for a couple years. We were both elders for about 4 or 5 years, I think. And I kind of remember that. And then Don, who was pastor when
Ed Bontrager.
Ed Bontrager, of course, came after Clyde Fulmer, and then was Ed Bontrager, yeah. A couple issues that the elders dealt with before I was an elder was in 1965 was civil rights was an issue. It is in my history book. Some of you may remember reading it. Vernon Glick in 1969 led a 13-week session on civil rights. It was controversial. A number of the older elders felt we shouldn't be talking about that sort of thing. And then about the same time, 67, 68, was Vietnam. And With magazine, the youth magazine, was criticized for being too liberal. And, so those were some of the issues. The charismatic movement also preceded us. I was not on the elders when the charismatic movement was an issue. And in fact, they had several sessions. This was our church at that time in here, dealing with the Holy Spirit. The first issue that I was involved with as an elder was divorce. We had Wednesday night sessions for a study, and that was in 1976. And then we decided, or the leadership decided, we're going to postpone it because Ed Bontrager is coming. And well, let's wait till Ed Bontrager comes. And so by that time, I was no longer an elder. And Don was, and he'll probably relate to that. The other issue, I must double check whether I was an elder at that time or not. I won't go into it now because I think some of the rest will deal with it, is the organ. I do know this, that there were requests, especially for weddings. They want to use the organ. In 1961, the church council said not to use the organ at weddings. And I think the issue will be dealt with in other respects. Okay, I think that's all I have.
Thank you, Roy. Now we'll go to Don Horning. As he mentioned, he served during the Bontrager era. There was a lot of things happening during that period.
Yeah, I think our former school teacher here was kind of brief. I think there was a lot more things he could have said. Yes, we can talk about the Bontrager era, but I'm a little concerned. I don't think he's in the audience, but I know he's in the county. I couldn't believe that, and I told him when I found out that he's in the county this weekend that we're going to be talking about him Sunday morning. And Ed is in town. Yes. Right? Well, I'll segue right into the divorce issue because it was an issue not unlike many of the issues we face today. As I approached this task, as we've been working on this, or I've been thinking about it for the past couple of months, it just keeps coming back, and I can't get away from it. That is, I do believe, and maybe it's my past 10 years working with the Historical Society, that history is many times not appreciated enough. And so as I was approaching this, it kept coming to me, how can who we have been inform who we will become? And you have this list of all the things that this church did that were really not acceptable to a lot of people at the time. And Don will make a comment about how the greater church saw us when he does his comments. So who we have been should inform, in some ways, who we will become. Divorce to me, is a major stepping point in this kind of thing. We acknowledged back then that divorce existed, even if the marriages weren't dissolved, people living in separate parts of the house, etc. Ed guided us by studying it deeply and I think Don Kemmer, he held sessions about it, wrote a book about it, or wrote some things about it. He really delved into it intellectually and theologically. He leaned towards a love-based approach rather than a rejection, rather than rejecting, and looked at a loving approach to it as a more godly response than an authoritarian rejection. And the way he worked at it, the way he proposed for our elders, and I remember distinctly him laying out the whole process, was if after we decided that we would entertain marriage of divorced parties and membership, he said he will interview the people to find out whether or not they are accepting responsibility for their past failures and whether they're willing to commit to changing their ways. If they were just looking for a church that was going to sanction their marriage in a church because the family wanted them to get married in church, he wouldn't recommend them. And slowly we adopted this methodology where he would interview people, and we were known as the divorce church. We stepped out where other churches were not, churches of our denomination were not willing to go. So we're very much a pioneer, and very much done in a very thoughtful, loving manner, even though the issue started out as, I use these descriptors, as conscientious, as contentious, as ignoring Scripture, as divisive. However, it was happening and couldn't be ignored. And this church stepped up to the plate. And I think that we have to keep that in mind as we look forward and don't turn inward. I will end this part of it by saying what seared my conscience and has probably informed me on the subject of divorce, and maybe with I will even mention my life with my wife, Carol, and how she would have to counsel people. And it kind of goes back to this statement. Ed, when we were about to vote on it, finished the conversation by laying out his plan and saying, this is how we could approach it. Or, he said, without animus or emotion, or we could deny and reject these couples' request, which would be tantamount to saying, why don't you go down the street to a church that's less perfect than us? And it just burned inside me. And I think Carol and I lived by that tenet the rest of our lives. Not just because of that, but as other contentious issues that came up. So I want that to be not as Ed offering an ultimatum, but he was stating a fact. Then as time went on, the other issue that I faced as an elder was pastoral leadership change. It wasn't totally a shock that Ed would leave, but it also wasn't totally accepted. And so then we moved to a period where many of you more of you will be involved with, and that was the coming of Lynn and Marietta. We did something, I'll say it's a bit humorous, and I don't see anybody from the North Group here to see whether or not this was recommended, but I recall distinctly when Ed announced his intention to terminate his stay here, something inside me allowed me to do this, or maybe it was my youthful, not youthful lack of decorum, but I think it was something I read somewhere, probably because I don't have that many unique thoughts. I said after the uncomfortable quietness among these four elders kind of went away, I said, do you have anybody in mind to take your position? Which I had heard was something that happens in corporate world where when a person's moving up, sometimes they had identified somebody who could take their job. And quite to my surprise, and I think everybody else's surprise, he said, yes, I do. He said, there's a young pastor down in the Eastern Shore by the name of Linford King, and he said, I think he has From what I understand, I think he has potential to be far more than a pastor of a small mission outreach church. And so we contacted him, and he said they thought about it for a while. I think we'd had a phone contact, and he and Marietta talked about it, and in due time called and gave us their rejection and said that they would not come.
They laughed about it first.
That's right, Roy. Thank you very much. Yeah, they were very quick to say when I hung up from my phone call, we both just laughed out loud, like we could never ever take that job. And so I've talked to Lynn about some of these things numerous times over, and he is fine with me telling these stories. And but something in us, I think, as an elder board, wasn't quite ready, and we did not accept his no. And so I was commissioned to write a letter, and we wrote a letter to say, in effect, you don't remember the letter, but it was, in effect, I don't think you've listened to the Lord's calling here. And in due time, they accepted the job. Whether it was the Holy Spirit's intervention or whether it was corporate politics at work, I don't really know. So they accepted the call. This is I think, a watershed time in Nessville's pilgrimage, because our church, after Lynn came and got footing, he became more involved in the community. Before that, we were this little white church behind the pine trees as you drove by on 501 that many people told me, oh, yes, that's really that's an interesting church back there. I've always thought it's a beautiful setting. They didn't know anything about it. Now he became chaplain of the police, and that gave a different feeling, and also it welcomed. He encouraged people to bring non-traditional Anabaptist or Mennonite thinking people into our fellowship, and I think it changed our fellowship tremendously and moved us to a bigger tent existence. I have written down, it brought creative tension on how diversity, and I describe diversity here as diversity of thought, diversity of opinion, diversity of understanding, how that diversity is celebrated and embraced, rather than just causing friction because here's people coming in that think differently, and Don will talk about some of the outcomes of that. So I think that should be looked upon as a watershed time, because it changed who we were and made us more. I guess it's a political statement, but a larger tent. You have more people coming in. And so I will acknowledge that with that comes new tensions then, but also new opportunities. And so back to my original statement of how do we look at who we have been to inform who we might become, what part does that bigger tent play in it? I don't know. I'm posing this as a question. Well, as it was stated before, that the other major thing was this is when I asked Rick about this, I said this is when I left the elders, but I think we kind of generally decided that talking about this is appropriate for an elders forum. And that was the building of the new church. And so I resigned as an elder with the elders' consent, because the feeling was that the building committee should not be housed in the elders, it should be separate, because the building committee was the building for everybody, and it wasn't a decision-making thing that the elders are going to decide what color the countertop is in the kitchen. And so we went off into a building program. This was after the building program, which had begun under Ed Bontrager, was put on ice for about 6 to 9 months, if I remember correctly, because we didn't want to be proceeding with a building program before the pastor who was going to administer or going to be our minister during the time of that construction and finish should be here to have input in it, which I think was a very intelligent way, and we just stopped. We had started with engaging the Troyer organization in Indiana, who did churches to do some planning, and they helped us with some planning. When we restarted it, the committee said, okay, how do we move forward? And so there was this uncomfortableness of moving forward with an Indiana company when in fact we had in our congregation somebody who builds buildings, including churches. And so it didn't seem right. And so before I talked to Troyer to try and find a solution to this, I talked to Cal and said the committee would like, and by the way, by now I had Harold Blank was my co-chair. We co-chaired this committee. And I said, I asked him about this, and he said, I have second thoughts about building a church for my fellow constituents. I don't want my building the church to become divisive with my friends. And I told him, I think I remember Cal, I said, why don't you let me take care of that, and I will argue with them. You don't have to. And so Cal said that he would do it. And then the next thing was to call Troyer, and I asked Troyer, do we own the prints that he had done? And he said, yes, we do. And I said, well, this is how the committee is progressing, and can we disengage with you? And he said, I think that's the only sensible thing to do. He would not have liked to build our church because he knew there's somebody here who can do it. I will say, again, tell me if I'm getting out of time. I will say again that that how we went about this whole process was kind of interesting, because when Troyer was here, he said, tell me about your congregation, who you are. And at that time, we were known as the Cadillac Church. And I don't know how many people know that part of it, but it had to do with our most especially with our real estate people, because we had a number of people in real estate. And when you're in real estate, when you're in real estate at that time, you would be expected to have two things to show that this is somebody you want to do business with: a large enough car to put a bunch of people in as you drive around looking at houses and possible locations, and a car of note. It wasn't just going to be a big old rusty sedan. And so there was a reason for that. But the outside people looking in said, yes, when you go by Neffsville, there'll be Cadillacs sitting out there, and so they kind of looked at it as a kind of a snide comment. And Troyer's comment was, well, then that's who you are, and build your church accordingly. And as plans went forward then, I think that the next thing on that same vein was that the High Group, especially Cal, came up with this term called simple elegance. It says, how can we be elegant? We can have an elegant building, but we can do it simply. And if you want me or Cal to walk around, we can walk around and show you some things that were done that look really cool, but they're really pretty simple. I can show you some inch by 5 inch boards on the side of the building or side of the sanctuary that make it look like we have paneling, but it's just a piece of wood over top of drywall. And so that's a case of simple elegance. So who you are, who we are, is important. So going forward, who we were could inform who we are. One thing I'll say in unity about as we go forward with other decisions that we'll be facing in the future. Oh, I will mention the pipe organ as well, because you talked about the organ being moved in to the church, sometimes rental organs, and so that was a first that we finally started using them for weddings, and my family, Carol's sister, was involved in that whole thing, and then we wind up with a pipe organ at being again a kind of at the head of churches accepting that. Okay, we had a goal of no one leaving the church during the building program, and I told the story of Pappy Landis from Mellingers, which was a guy who, some of you know who he was. He did not favor the building program, but on a hot Saturday when they were trimming mortar off of bricks to reuse them in a patio, and the ladies had lemonade, and everybody stopped quickly to get lemonade. Pappy was over there clinking away at the bricks, and somebody yelled at him and said, Pappy, get over here and get some lemonade, it's hot. And as he walked over, he muttered under his breath, not angrily, but saying, "Sure is hot. I wonder where all the people are that voted for this project." And so that I'll end with that as saying, I think that you can have issues on which people don't agree, and yet you can stay unified.
Thank you, Don. Now we'll go to Don Kemmer, who served 3 non-consecutive terms, and for his comments.
All right. All right. Okay. Excuse me. I think I'll remain seating. I have a little difficulty standing. I was an elder from 1979 to 1996. At that time, I was 4 years on, 2 years off, 4 and 2 years off, 4 and 2 years off, because I wanted to. I felt after 4 years I wanted to be in a congregation and see what things look like. And I was on the board at AMBS, and I tried the same thing, and they got very upset. And their concept was the first 4 years when you learn your way around and make associations and so forth, and the next 4 years is where you contribute. So I want to thank Roy Burkholder for the Pathways to Renewal. I read that from beginning and then again in preparation for this, and Don Horning in his list of first and early adoptions, in which we get the divorced church and so forth. And Rick, thank you very much for your organization of this. The church is not only a place for celebration of the saints, but is primarily a hospital for sinners. That is where we moved along in the 90s when Linda was here. I want to add one statement you made, and as I said, by the way, everything I say here this morning about myself or about anybody and so forth is related to the topic of namely the elders and where the church was going and the problems, so forth. So I'd like you to keep that in mind. But I was on the board in all through the United States of AMBS, and I can tell you other things, exposure, and I can tell you that Nessville is famous, notorious, depending what you say. It's rather interesting. Nessville is known everywhere, okay? And it's just kind of fascinating. Who is this Nessville? I would get questions, you know. Can anybody go there? That's a big question we always got. But anyhow, during that time, the late 80s and the 90s, the church grew, and it grew a lot from migration from Lancaster County. However, that migration stopped later because Lancaster County people, Lancaster Conference people can now own TV. They can even wear a wedding ring, which was a big contention at one time. So we did not apologize for the fact that anybody could be a member at Nessville. We never apologized for that. I'm talking now as an elder. During the 90s, our members were encouraged to participate in community organizations. Examples, as was mentioned before, Linford King became chaplain of the MT Police Department. I was lead physician in the Mem Township School District. I was a physician for the Lancaster Police Department and was called many times to testify in court cases and so forth. I would be practicing maybe in my office, and they'd call and say, "Hey, we need your testimony." I'd go down, and if I walked in, everything would stop. And they'd put me up there, and I'd be sworn in or affirmed, and then testimony, and when I left, they went back to whatever they were doing before. But it's rather interesting. But that, interpret that, and the fact that that's what Nessville Mennonite Church wanted to become, a church in which the people participated in the community. During that time, I can tell you, as an elder, we were that close to getting the Mennonite out of the name and becoming Nestville Community Church. It was felt that the Mennonite was a cultural inhabitants. It signified Northern European and Swiss and Russian and so forth, white people primarily. And so we get that Mennonite out of the name, we are a community church. And we were that close to making that movement. I might add also that we had, I mentioned a physician, we had local, several public school teachers at that time. High Industries was very active in the community. We also, was a very contentious time, was when they experimented with different services, a contemporary service and a traditional service. And the contemporary service and the traditional service were complete services. And Ninford preached the same sermon at both services. He preached twice in those mornings. And it was so contentious that at one of our elders' meeting, one of the elders got up and left. He was so upset, for example. But we survived. And there's no ill feelings at all, that's for sure. And we eventually settled with a blended service, what we call our blended service. All of these changes, divorce, acceptance, blended service, and so forth, resulted in the loss of some members. We lost members. I know I lost 3 or 4 when we developed a blended service. 3 or 4 couples who were friends of ours, they decided to go somewhere else. They wanted a more contemporary service. But then we had other people who came in and the church at that time grew. So it was interesting. I'm going to tell a story quickly of Jack Nunemacher. Now, how many remember Jack Nunemacher? Jack Nunemacher, I first met him in about, I think it was the early 70s. I was just starting my practice, and I got a call about 9:30 at night. I was closing the office, and the medical bureau said, this man needs a house call. And I said, oh, okay. And he'd like to know if he didn't want his family doctor. He wanted a unknown doctor I was new just in the second time back in practice at that time. So I said, okay, on the way home I'll stop in. So I might say I still don't drive past this house without thinking of this. I went in and I stopped in, and there was Jack in bed, bleeding. And he had been shot by his first wife because he was caught in bed with another woman. And at that day and age, you couldn't do this now, but that day and age he wanted it kept quiet. Since he was a member of the Graham Township Police Department, he didn't want any scandal, so I kept it quiet, and the bullet went in and no bullet was there, and I cleaned the wound and went in antibiotics, and he recovered with no problem. But there was never any mention of it anywhere, not in the papers or the 24-hour news or anything like that at that time. So that was Jack Nunemacher, and he was known as Jack Nunemacher. I'll say it that way. So here we come, and Linford made the acquaintance, and he has a story. You have the story in your book. Yeah, you can read it in there. I won't go into that. But anyhow, Jack and Rita came to this church, and they were true Anabaptists. They were both, Jack was rebaptized, and he was one of the most saintly people I knew. I mean, he lived close to where we lived, and Mary and I knew Jack and Rita, and he was more of a Christian than I was, put it that way. And so that's a testimony I have to that. The other story is of Rick Barnett. I don't know if Rick's here or not. He said I can use his name. I asked him. Rick Barnett wanted to become a member, and one requirement was that he would be rebaptized. And he had been baptized as an infant. And he respected that. He respected his parents decided to do that. And for about a year, we dealt with this question. Can we admit someone to an Anabaptist church, Nashville Anabaptist Mennonite church, who does not adhere to the requirement that if they were baptized as an infant, they should be rebaptized. Well, we dealt with this in many ways. And finally, we decided that baptism, according to the Mennonites and the Anabaptists, was a sign, not a sacrament. In other words, you didn't need to be baptized to be saved. It was a sign of your commitment to Jesus. But the important thing that we followed Jesus. We followed the teaching. We followed Jesus. If you wanted to join this group of people who wanted to follow Jesus, and why then you could become a member without being rebaptized. So we went and we told Rick Barnett this. I remember that. And after he told him, Rick said, I want to be baptized. So since he wasn't required to, then he wanted to be. So I thought I always remember that. So he's a true Anabaptist, okay? So I think I'll just finish with the statement that through the years, the evolution, you might say, of all the different changes have been made and so forth, it still follows that we're a church of people who are committed to following Jesus.
Thank you, Don. The one thing I forgot to mention early on was we talked about firsts. So we had on your table there a list of firsts we thought of, some significant, substantial, and then I listed some at the bottom, some things I thought were first. So we'll go into a period of questions or discussion. I ask that you wait till I bring the mic to you, and as we are recording this, and look forward to your comments. While you're thinking, I thank Don, Roy, and Don. When I came up with this idea, I asked them, and I had yeses from all three, and that felt great that they were willing and excited about doing this. Henry.
I'm Henry Benner, member of Paradise Lancaster Conference for 68 years, and let me tell you what we thought of you guys. You were just a bunch of rebels. You didn't want to dress plain, you wanted television, and I thought, how can a church be spiritual based on negativism? It wasn't until I read Roy Burkholder's book, where it came out of the Brunk revivals, and you were very evangelical, and Dean Harold Bender of Goshen Seminary, who ran the church, called up John Martin and said, John, get up there and become pastor of Nashville and save it for the Mennonite church. And I've been happy at Nashville for the last 20 years.
Thank you, Henry. Anyone else? It's Darrell Denlinger.
Yeah, Don, I'm really curious about how you said we came so close to not being Nashville Mennonite Church. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
I'll say a little more about it. I can't say too much about it because individuals are involved, okay? But I will say that, and this comes from some of this is a holdover from the first 10 years of the church, you might say. And there were, on the elders, 1, 2, at least, well, there were 2 elders that, let's see now, both of them are deceased now, right? Okay. That were, from the very beginning, were leaning that way and were very enamored of Calvary Independent Church. And they thought we should be like Calvary Independent, my way of putting it. And there were people, members of the church, who also went along with that concept of being a community church. And not being a member of a conference, for instance, being independent. Of course, then they had a conference of independent churches. But, and I think during the time of the conflict with the contemporary mode of worship and the traditional mode of worship, there was danger, and there was a considerable exodus of some people when they decided to have the blended service. And you'll see some in his book about some dollars that resigned, and I happen to know that some resigned under that because of that reason. But we decided to have a blended service. It was difficult. We lost quite a few couples with that, but that's what we decided, put it that way.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mike Peachy.
This is a question for all of you, and whoever wants to take it, feel free. But so much of the discussion and list here is of things of controversy or tough decisions or division and that kind of thing. Can you speak to, or do you remember, can you highlight anything that were times of celebration and times of unity and times of just great things happening here at Neffsville?
I would say that after almost all of them, there was a period of calm and celebration. I think that's kind of my what undergirds everything I've done here. That almost every period of contention was followed by successes, and new people came because of the decision. We'll go back to the divorce thing. People became, after they remarried in this church, after having been divorced, became active members and active in the church. And then the biggest disappointment for me was that, and it was a smiling disappointment, if you will, Mike, and that was that as their churches started to accept, they sometimes left and went back to their home church. And so we did keep them for their own church. And so it was a little disappointing. So for me, I think that, while we didn't highlight them, I think that on many of these, take the building of the church, which was not contentious, but nevertheless it was stressful. Everybody was, the day we moved in, everybody was sitting with smiles and feeling of unity that they were here. So I don't know. I think I wouldn't say, I'm not answering your question specifically. I'm just saying that I think following periods of contention, maybe many times, was a period of calm.
I can't say anything definitely. Okay. Sorry. I'm going to think about that.
We can come back to you in a moment then.
Okay.
Anyone else? Paul Metzler.
Yeah, as you were talking, we were also known as a music church. And we had quite a few years where we were very involved with music and held nights of music. We brought in special people. We had our men's quartet sing for 10 years during the John Martin years. And we are currently, of course, doing things a little differently here. But the interesting part that I see for the future is we are known for our acoustics, and the conservative Mennonite groups want to come here not only to rehearse, but also give programs. And look at the opportunity we have for cooperation. So I'm excited about that, all right?
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone else? We have a few minutes left. Steve?
When you were considering changing the name, or when the name change from Mennonite to community was under consideration, how did the issue of most of us not actually living in the community figure into the discussion of being a community church?
Does anyone of you want to discuss it?
I don't know.
That's a good question, excellent question, because that question was actually brought up many times in this discussion, namely that we were, as you mentioned, we were a church in which people drove to. Our parking lot was full. I had a good friend on another board, he was a pastor, and he used to ask me, what's going on there at Nessville? He said, I drive past and the parking lot's bulging and full. He said, that must be really good, the good things going on there. But you're right, we were not a community church in that sense that majority of our members came from outside the community. That when we talked about being active in the community, that was one way of trying to foster being more of a community church. But yeah, that's a good question, yeah.
Cal High?
I thought I'd be quiet today, but I go back to the days when we were working on the construction of this church, and the word acoustics. Remember that? Yeah. We had an acoustician here, and sometimes I think that's more luck than a science, but we had somebody here that I just didn't care for his thinking. I said, this is not a music hall, this is a sanctuary. And we ended up dismissing him. And we engaged someone else as an acoustician. And it was interesting, he was on the phone, I think in Chicago or somewhere. We had about 15 people lined up here, discussion back and forth. And I don't know if it was luck or not, but our acoustics came out pretty well. When the person came in to design the organ, snapping his fingers, he said, the acoustics are great here. And it's a touchy subject, just brought back memories when we were going through that. And it was hard for me to do, to dismiss someone and bring someone else in. But someone else used that same acoustician, and they were very disappointed at their church.
Yeah, I remember that. This is a lighter portion of this discussion, but it's very real. And it was not a snap of the fingers. It was this. I was standing back in a corner here the day he came. It was a couple days before we had our first service, and he did this. He went like this. Now that falls flat in here because this room is designed to be for speaking. But over there, you could hear it reverberate, and he said, "Yes, we got it." And so, but yes, it really goes to who we are, because we were talking about the spoken word. How do you get a balance between what Paul wants and what a pastor wants? And so he was sensitive to that balance, and for that reason, you don't sit on pillowed pews like you do in lots of churches. You're sitting on hard surface, because he said that would be a killer when it comes to acoustics. But he did allow us to put carpet underneath the pews, but he would rather have not done that. He wanted double drywall on the gables, but Cal said we're going to do single drywall because the bases are just going to have to work harder. So those are some of the things we went through. This is the light part, but it's the fun part. Maybe back to Mike. We had many times through all the contentious parts. I mean, even celebratory after the divorce issues, we were celebratory. When you brought somebody in and they became a full-fledged member and active in the church, what a celebration! You've saved them from whatever could have happened. Rick, where's Rick? There we go.
Yeah, we're about out of time, but maybe take one more question, if there's any. Or if not, any final comments from our panel? Okay.
Well, in this process, while I might have thought about all these things before, I certainly never enumerated them or sat and mulled them over. But I think that it's a spectacular church, and has done things way above what the charter members would have ever dreamed, and maybe done many things the charter members wouldn't have approved of in the beginning, but I think at the end they might have said, yes, it was good to have done it. And so I think I also think you have to listen to youth, because a lot of these things, as I thought about them as we were going through them, younger people, and by let's not say youth, younger people. So if the elders are all 80, you got a problem, because the next generation is looking for different iterations, I'll say, of how they bring faith to their life. And so we have to constantly be keeping a finger to the wind to say, what are the next generations wanting? And I know that's a very, very difficult time right now. But you're going to see more about this, I think, in society in general, because there's a lot of things that have been hijacked by older generations, and you're going to see younger generations say, no, I don't think we should do it that way. So that one might be for future forums.
That's actually a good lead into my announcement for next week. Just a reminder, next week after worship, we'll be having a light lunch, pizza provided on Sunday school. What do we do with Sunday school post-COVID? We have about 80 people here this morning. Sunday school has been struggling to some degree, and so we look forward to your participation into that roundtable discussion next week, led by Alan Miller. So with that, I've asked Jerry Wenger, current chair of the Board of Elders, to close us in prayer.
Before we close, and since you gave me a mic, I thought I would like to thank Rick for putting this together, and Dean. Let's give them a round of applause. This is a reminder for me that we stand on the shoulders of those who went before us. So thank you, Don, and Roy, for all you've done. You indeed have been exemplary predecessors for those of us that sit on the current elder leadership team. It's very meaningful for us to see what you went through, as we are going through a number of things as well. I think it's more fun to look back on those things than to ruminate at the current time, so I was not going to get into any current discussions because they're not in the past. Hopefully someday we'll have a new nickname for the church, and it will be just as jovial as Cadillac or Divorce or TV or whatever, but we are working through a lot of things, and if you want to have your name on future lists, we are looking for 2 or 3 new elders by the end of the year. There's several of us that'll be stepping down, and I just think it's a good time to think about that process and who you want to have on the elder leadership team, and we will be contacting you about the process. As soon as we get through the budget phase, we will be talking about the elder succession plan for the church. So thank you all for being here. If you would join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the 70 years of Nessville Mennonite Church and all that it has meant to all that have been a part of it. We pray your continued blessing on our staff, our elders, our volunteers, and the parishioners that make up this congregation, and ask that you would continue that blessing on into the next 70 years and beyond. We thank you for the people that have served in the past and for those that are serving now to make it what it is today. This we ask in your name. Amen.